cell phones, and any other electronic devices? Thank you. Well, good morning. I'm Joanne Myers, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I want to welcome our members, guests, and C-SPAN Book TV to this Public Affairs Breakfast program. Today's discussion will be based on a new book, which is just being released today, entitled Fight for Liberty, Defending Democracy in the Age of Trump. Copies will be available for you to purchase at the end of the hour today. But before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank Jamie Leifer, who was indispensable in arranging the speakers for this program. So thank you, Jamie. At a time when liberal democracy is on the defensive, when there is doubt and discord from both the left and the right, not only here at home but around the world, we are extremely honored to be hosting this eminent group of pundits. Our speakers, whose roots reflect the political spectrum, are in alphabetical order: Washington Post columnist and senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Max Boot, who will serve as moderator; constitutional law professor and director for the Center for National Security at Columbia Law School, Philip Bobbitt; legendary world chess champion and chairman of the Human Rights Foundation, Garry Kasparov; and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist at the New York Times and senior political contributor for NBC News, Bret Stephens. Each have contributed a very wise and thoughtful essay to this edited volume in which they champion the values on which the free world was built. Among the surfeit of books on the threats to liberal democracy, Fight for Liberty stands out not only for the multitude of views that analyze the threats to the liberal world order, but in offering possible solutions. The contributors to this project are optimistic in that having a fresh discussion on moral values and basic principles such as freedom of speech, a free press, and the rule of law, democracy can be brought back to health. To begin the conversation for the recovery, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our dream team of panelists who, with their overall command of American history, mastery of foreign policy, and profound familiarity with current events, will guide us through the prevailing minefield of what they see as a global assault on democracy. Thank you all for being here today.
Well, thank you, Joanne, for setting expectations so low for us. Anyway, it's a delight to be here, and thank you for hosting us. I have many fond memories of foreign policy seminars at the Carnegie Council, so great to be back here and with such a distinguished group of colleagues. Let me read you a few words from something called the Renewed Democracy Manifesto. The modern world is at risk of losing its way. The liberal democratic order is under attack from within and without. In response, a committee has been formed to respond to the crisis. The free world must rally in defense of free societies and their values and promote them where they are most urgently needed, and must reject intimidation or suppression of speech rooted in ideological rigidity or intolerance of political difference. Western proponents of the liberal democratic order must first promote those values at home and defend them abroad. There is still a center in Western politics, and it needs to be revitalized intellectually, culturally, and politically. The center left and center right are still joined by a broad set of common values, including a respect for free speech and dissent, a belief in the benefits of international trade and immigration, respect for law and procedural legitimacy, a suspicion of cults of personality, and an understanding that free societies require protection from authoritarians promising easy fixes to complex problems. Now, those are all part of this Renewed Democracy Manifesto that was issued last year by this new group called the Renewed Democracy Initiative that we are all affiliated with. Garry over here is the chairman of that group. I'm on the board of directors. We're all involved in various ways. And that group has now produced not just this manifesto, which was signed by a very distinguished group of people, and you can go online for the whole list of signers who include thought leaders from both the left and the right, and both Europe as well as the United States. But now we've also produced an edited volume of essays, which is out today, called Fight for Liberty, Defending Democracy in the Age of Trump. And it has a truly distinguished lineup of contributors with an introduction by John Meacham, and everybody on the stage here has contributed to it along with a number of other people. So this is essentially our attempt to fight back against what we see as the threats to democracy from both the far left and the far right, as the manifesto says, to try to revitalize the vital center, which is which is under assault, and this is obviously a massive undertaking, and what we're doing is not intended to be political. It's not intended to win elections, at least not in the immediate or direct sense. But what it's intended to do is to bring forward the ideas and to revitalize an intellectual opposition to the threats that confront our society and confront so many societies around the world. And it's truly striking to see how widespread the threat is. I mean, you have a fascist on the verge of winning the presidency in Brazil. You have democracy undermined in places like Poland and Hungary and the Philippines. It's a very broad-ranging threat. It's not just the United States, but obviously, there's not going to be a solution without addressing what's going on in this country, because we are still the most powerful country in the world, and if we are not lending our voice to standing up for the values that we have built our country on, I think the entire world is going to be in trouble. So I don't want to talk a lot. I'm truly here to be the moderator and let the sparkling panelist panel have their say. And I'd like to begin by turning it over to Phil Bobbitt.
Thank you. Thank you for asking us. I know we're all very happy to be here. Everyone in this room, I'm confident, can recite Morris's words that begin the American Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. But how many of you have asked, more perfect than what? More perfect in what way? The Philadelphia Convention met in order to create a set of rules and bylaws for the American state that would serve the values of the Declaration of Independence and do so more effectively than had the Articles of Confederation. Our founders apparently believed that it was necessary to establish and maintain national institutions of justice, to secure civil peace by federal instruments against insurrection, to arm the Union of States as a whole and not individually against predators, to promote opportunity and prosperity by national means, and this is the important phrase, in order to secure, as they put it, liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Like most law students of my generation, I was taught the Declaration of Independence, while important historically, had no legal status, because unlike the Constitution, it was not ratified by the people. Unlike the Articles, it was not ratified by the states. On this matter, as in so many others, I was turned around by the insights of the late Charles Black. Black argued that the Constitution was contrived as an organizational means of carrying out the project of the Declaration. That is it was the organization of a state that would secure a society where no man was another man's sovereign. All men were created equal. Where there were certain rights that could not be sold or bartered or given away. They couldn't be alienated. Where the legitimacy of the government depended upon regularly securing the free consent of its people. Indeed, we know from the Declaration itself what the purpose of the American state is supposed to be. And it's not to provide for the common defense or secure the general welfare and so on. Everyone in this room can recite one passage from American literature. We could all do it in our heads just now. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. But now, this is the part I want you to focus on. That to protect these rights, governments are instituted among men. The purpose of government, according to the Declaration, the justification for the American seizure of sovereignty from the British colonial governments, is to protect human rights, full stop. That's the American constitutional ethos. In light of our perilous experience with the Articles, some of the new rules and bylaws were pretty obvious. The American state needed a secure source of revenue in order to provide for its defense. It needed a system of checks and balances to prevent tyranny, which might well arise as a consequence of arming and responding to external threats. It needed to explicitly and implicitly guarantee rights of conscience, and indeed to build in the exercise of the conscience as part of governing, whether in juries or polling booths or in the councils of state. So thought the founding generation. but it seems that these struggles must be refought by every generation. It hasn't been a good couple of years for the informal constitutional norms that support the American constitutional ethos. A president who vows to incarcerate his political opponents, who as a candidate refused to commit to accepting the verdict of the election, whose staff attempted to conspire with a hostile foreign power in cyber burglaries and cyber propaganda campaigns, who encourages violence against the press. Such a person is the embodiment of a troubling historical departure. A president who asserts the power to pardon himself, who attempts to coerce the head of the FBI to shelve an investigation into his aides, who exhorts naval officers to commit themselves to partisan declarations, who demeans judges on the basis of their ethnicity, who invents and persists in telling the now proven untruth that his predecessor was wiretapping him, who engages in a studied campaign to delegitimate the electoral process itself by falsely claiming that millions of votes have been stolen, and who uses the office of the presidency to enrich himself and his family. Such a person strikes, however haphazardly, at constitutional norms that are not codified, but they dwell in the consciences of the men who have held that office. Of course, the president is not the only figure on the stage who seems heedless of those constitutional norms that are meant to protect our liberties. Incivility in our politics, the petty harassment of officials, the intolerance of the very expression of ideas with which we disagree, and the cultivation of recovered memories of historic shame are projects on which the president does not seem to have a monopoly. But these are also threats as to which we must be vigilant. Moreover, the weakening of our constitutional institutions and of our confidence in them will have a profound consequence for world order, which was the subject of the chapter that I contributed to this book. A growing lack of national cohesion and self-confidence will excite external threats. But threats need not necessarily bring ruin. As Archibald MacLeish once put it, they may be the grit with which the oyster mends his shell. The Constitution, written and unwritten, is constructed to enable us to carry out the project of the Declaration. The Declaration expresses a liberal ethos of tolerance, social mobility based on talent and effort, a pluralist society with power derived from consent. It's the Constitution that provides the mechanism for determining our futures. How and whether we will realize the vision of the Declaration is something that's in our hands. New threats to that vision, as well as the inherited ones, are the grist for its operation. I think that's what Barack Obama had in mind when he spoke at the 50th anniversary of the Selma March. He asked, what greater form of patriotism is there than the belief that America is not yet finished, that we are strong enough to be self-critical, that each successive generation can look upon our imperfections and decide that it is in our power to remake this nation to more closely align with our highest ideals. Of course, this means it's also in our power to degrade these ideals. I take it the purpose of this book and the purpose of our getting together is to prevent that. Thank you.
Garry?
Yes. Well, good morning. Thanks for having us here today. I would like to say a few words about RDI, the organization, Renew Democracy Initiative. So it started almost 2 years ago in the beginning of 2017 with a group of intellectuals, both from right and left, getting together here in New York and thinking about the future. It was not just about Trump's elections, but also our recognition of the fact that the same threats to democracy could be noticed in Europe. Philippines were mentioned, Poland, Hungary, Brazil, but looking at Germany, France, Austria, Italy, the United Kingdom, we could see the same very dangerous trend, with political center being decimated and the political fringes gaining more and more power, both on the right and the left. And so the Trump effect here is probably was just was the continuation of this tide We also thought that the very fact that a person like Donald Trump could be elected, the president of the United States, legally, in fair and square elections, and the fact is that two major political parties ended up with candidates having overall 120% negative rating, told us that something was wrong with the system. But we believe that democracy hasn't failed us. We failed democracy. So the idea was to look at this tide and find the right framework that will allow us to recover these premises where we could debate. People who got together to form RDI, they probably they could agree on very little if you analyze their record in American political life. But they agreed that we needed this framework to be preserved to continue the debate. Because what we could see is that's the political middle by being decimated, created political chaos that, as we know from history, always led to the rise of dictatorship, whether on the right or the left. And it's like in political physics. You push pendulum too far on the right, and you could see the reaction on the left. And we are afraid, again, looking at this country and also at Europe, is that extreme on one side generates excitement on the far side, on the opposite side of this pendulum. And we don't believe that one extremism on one side is a proper response to extremism on the other. We also wanted to remind people that just looking, for instance, back to the 30s, that Hitler has never won elections in Germany. The maximum he got was 37.2%. But at the same elections, communists made nearly 16. So that means more than half of the Germans rejected democracy. And now looking, for instance, even at France, where, thanks God, they had Macron, who could save the Republic, but still in the first round of presidential elections, Marine Le Pen made 21%, while Mélenchon, the far left candidate, made nearly 20%. So not even talking about Great Britain, where the reaction on Brexit that was pushed by the far right was the rise of unreformed socialists on the Labour side. And the latest program announced by Labour Party at their conference is just it's something unseen in British politics. We just discussed with Brett this morning that even the first Labour government in 1923, Macdonald's government, was not so radical in their suggestions to what they call reform market economy. Basically, you have now a Labour Party that is on the rise in the UK that is arguing that market economy has exhausted itself, and they want to go back to central planning. For somebody who was born and raised in the Soviet Union, I know the outcome. And so that's a trend. On the left, you have an attack on market economy. On the right, you have an attack on liberal democracy. And it's very important for us to actually recover this faith in democratic institutions. And we always looked at the Declaration of Independence and Federalist Papers as the foundation for our work, because it's time to actually to incorporate these values that help to form this great republic into the 21st century, to make them more modern. So our working title for the book, which of course was rejected by the publisher, was Federalist Papers 2.0. So we said that we were fighting for life and liberty and the pursuit of sanity in this insane time of Donald Trump. The book is it's the first project of the organization, and there's 30 essays there, again written by people from both sides, and it's divided in three sections: principles, threats, and solutions. Not that we know all the answers, but it's very important that we actually start this debate, and we want to show that there is an alternative to extremes on one side or another. So we don't want American political cycle to be caught in the same trap as in many European countries, where again the far right energizes far left, and then rational people are left with no choice but to pick up one one side or another. And it's this tide cannot be reversed unless America recovers its global leadership. First of all, on moral values. And right now we could see that Washington and Oval, in this case, more likely Oval Office, sends other signals. What Donald Trump has been doing and saying encourages dictators and authoritarian leaders around the world, while attacking American allies and questioning the traditional institutions that preserve peace and prosperity in the world. He has been praising and finding all sorts of excuses for illiberal forces. And it's not probably surprising that they are on the rise today, though it's like a chicken and egg, because you can also argue that Donald Trump was a result of the rise of liberalism that you could trace back to the beginning of the 21st century. It's hard to imagine that in 27 years after the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union, we live at a time where, for 13 straight years, the index of freedom in the world has been steadily going down. So you could see more and more countries adopting undemocratic style of ruling and authoritarian leaders because they believe that it would serve them well. But the biggest challenge, of course, is in the United States and in European countries, in the European Union. Well, we could see that many young people, they believe that democracy could be replaced by some sort of a Chinese model. And it's, again, I've been arguing using my Soviet background with many of these young people and the ideologues behind this school of thought, that it's not an answer. So the socialism failed, but it's very important for us to actually find the sort of right model, how to incorporate the values that made this country great and made the free world prosperous and so powerful into the 21st century, and maybe just to create some sort of an excitement, because radical views, they're always very attractive for youngsters. You would like to be on one side or another because you're changing the world. And the status quo always losing to more dynamic ideologies, no matter how cruel and unhuman ideology is. So it's very important for us to add this, you may call it sex appeal, to the centrists, to actually to help them to recognize that without this strong foundation for liberal democracy and market economy, we cannot succeed, and we can definitely modernize it. Because all these institutions that serve this country well, they're getting rusty after almost 250 years. But we should not look for total destruction of the foundation that is indispensable for achieving our goals and building the bright future.
We're here to make sexism centrism
Yes.
sexy.
Yes.
Brett?
I was about to say,
Centrism sexy.
I can hardly think of a better way to add sex appeal to liberal democracy than put the four of us on stage. Garry said something that I thought was fundamental and profound and is worth dwelling a little further on, which is the line that democracy didn't fail us, we failed, or we are failing democracy. And I think I'd like to ask you to think that thought through, because when we have conversations about the rise of Trump or the rise of populism, typically what you read is arguments making the case that structural failings in our democratic systems, whether it's the mechanisms of representation, the overrepresentation of small states, economic issues, socioeconomic issues, that all of these have contributed to the resurgence of a kind of illiberal populism of both the right and the left. And I think there's some truth to that mode of analysis. But the other way in which there's been, I think, a broad failure has been really pedagogical. One of the striking facts is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which happened when I was 18 years old, I don't think there was ever a pedagogy to explain to a younger generation those who are now in their 20s, exactly why did the Soviet Union fail? Why do centrally planned economies tend to lead toward tyrannical outcomes? Why was it a pretty good bet, for example, that as soon as Hugo Chavez started taking Venezuela down the path he was taking it, that you would end up with the authoritarian regime that you had? And it failed also because we've had a general neglect here in the United States of civics education at almost every level of schooling. Today, one of the things I have to say as someone who identifies as conservative is I find it ironic to hear some of my friends on the left say you have a president who doesn't believe in truth, he doesn't believe in the American system, he doesn't believe in checks and balances, and you say, well, hang on a second. The American Academy for many years on the left was saying there's no such thing as truth, it's all relative, and the American system is a sham based on the powers and privileges of a handful of white men at the expense of everyone else. So it's a little late to start trying to recover those sorts of values and that mentality, but I hope not too late. And so the essence of this book, I think, is to restore the pedagogy, if you will, of freedom. What we want this book to be read by distinguished people like you in this room, but we want your kids to read it. And we want high school students and college students to read this to understand what are the foundational concepts which go not only into the construction of a free and liberal social order, but a free and liberal global order, and how those two things come together. And Phil's essay in particular does an incredible job of explaining just that. I want to make just one or two additional remarks. You know, the last time I spoke in this room for the Carnegie Council was when I was an editorial deputy editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. I was on Fox News all the time. I was clearly affiliated with the right. Times change, as Max also can attest. But you know, I came of age. As I said, I graduated from high school the year the Soviet Union collapsed. But for many years afterwards, in part because of the interests of my late father, I had a kind of an antiquarian interest in the literature of totalitarianism. So I read Hannah Arendt, for instance, when I was in college. I read a lot of the dissident literature that emerged from the Soviet orbit, and it always fascinated me. But I always saw it as a kind of an interesting analysis of a bygone era, of something that happened in the 20s and 30s. You read Darkness at Noon, for example, and you think, how does a guy come to those sorts of conclusions when he's willing to accept the verdict that at some level he knows is untrue, against him, Orwell and so on. One person I read in particular who had a profound impact on me was, and I'm going to mangle his name to any Polish speaker in the room, but Czesław Miłosz, the Polish Nobel laureate, wrote an amazing book in the 1950s called The Captive Mind. And if you haven't read it, do yourselves a favor, and after you read this book, because it's almost as good, but read Miłosz's Captive Mind. One of the things that I thought was very striking was how it understood that the mental byways, the pathways by which his generation of Polish intellectuals coming out of World War II ended up becoming convinced Stalinists. They did not become convinced Stalinists because they were pressured to do so by the regime, because they were living in fear of their lives. They found sort of alibis and excuses for accepting the new Stalinist order as inevitable and in some sense as just. And so it was a much more complicated, the point Miłosz was making is that the psychology of authoritarianism, of populism, of totalitarianism is in fact a much more complicated psychology than many of us in the West have typically recognized. A striking feature, and this is the point I want to finish with, a striking feature for me being at the Wall Street Journal's editorial page was suddenly seeing conservative colleagues who a year earlier would never have had anything to do with the kind of politics that were coming to the fore with Trump, the liberalism, the screeching, the coarseness, and so on, suddenly find alibis and excuses for why they could go along with this. Why? Because it was a Manichaean world and Trump was better than Hillary. or because we had to accept that we were no longer in the post-Cold War era and that Trump was alighting on truths about trade and international relations that rendered all of our previous beliefs about immigration and free trade irrelevant. And it was like reading Miloš in real time. I could point to various figures who I won't name, but you read them in papers too, and you'd say, that's what happens. That's how they move. That's how they come to accept the notion that truth is contingent and history leads inevitably in some kind of dark direction, and you'd better accept it. And so the final point that I want to make is part of the pedagogy of liberty isn't simply understanding what makes the free world strong and robust and why we have to maintain those institutions, but it's to be alert to the kind of dark lure of an authoritarian psychology to which all sorts of people in this country and around the world are succumbing and have succumbed. And if we can arm ourselves intellectually that way, I think we can start to make the kind of inroads for the sake of the world we all want to preserve that so far we haven't been able to achieve.
Phil, you wanted to say something?
When everything was fine and the earth was ready to rejoice and consume without creeds or utopias, I was troubled, waking up at night, muttering at dawn, surrounded by the books of prophets and theologians, of poets and philosophers. I searched for an answer. What troubled me was a bit shameful. Talking of it aloud might even seem a crime against the health of mankind. That's a passage from Miloš. And he's talking about the break point after the end of the Cold War. Anyway.
Hope everybody else has memorized Miloš here as well. Did you want to say something, Garry?
Just following Brett's point about this erosion that just gradually conquers mind of intelligent people. So I think that Trump is kind of a test. So whether it's a little injection or it's a vaccine, so that is this, it's not strong enough to kill the body, but actually to give an immunity. So I hope for latter. I think that's what we think could happen if we just if we react accordingly to the threat, and just to make sure that this experience will be a wake-up call. Because for so many years I heard in this country that, okay, it's all fine here. Don't talk about your problems in Russia, in Iran, in China. It's elsewhere. It's not going to happen in this country. So ignoring what once Ronald Reagan said, that freedom is always one generation away from extinction. Now I think Americans are learning it, and so I hope that the Trump experience will be a good lesson especially for young people, to recognize that they have so many ways of influencing their own future.
Reagan was wrong. It's only 8 years away.
Yes. No, but you have. That's what I'm trying to tell them. Is just you have such a powerful weapon in your hands. You can vote. In many countries in the world, billions of people in the world are fighting and dying for the right to vote, and here you have this right. And while everybody talks about 80,000 votes that decided, the fate of the elections in 2016, I would consider 90 million people that didn't vote. I think that's fundamental. So we just have to bring people in. So participate in democracy, vote, damn it.
I want to just add one thing to what Brett said, because since Brett and I have traveled in the same circles, I've seen the same process of rationalization that he describes with Trump and what he represents. But I would add there is another phase which I think we've now entered into. Rationalization was the first phase. The second phase is complicity, because the more you rationalize and the more you become complicit in what he is doing, the more you have a stake in defending it, and you become part of this assault on democracy yourself. And then you're not rationalizing at arm's length. Then you start to embrace fully, and you become part of that movement. And you start, and we've seen this with people who were, saying, well, I don't like Donald Trump, but, he's doing a few good things. And the part about I don't like Trump is progressively fading away. And instead, you're hearing about how only somebody like Trump could do all these wonderful things that he is doing. And you're seeing a more fervent embrace on the part of so many intellectuals and Republican Party figures, and it's deeply disturbing.
Another point connected to that, the late, great Daniel Patrick Moynihan. There's, by the way, a wonderful documentary that's just come out about him. He had this wonderful line about defining deviancy down. And he was referring, he wrote an essay in the early 1990s when crime was really rising at an alarming rate. And he noted how the Valentine's Day Massacre, which shocked America in the 1920s, involved something like 14 people being killed. Now, on any given night in Chicago, 70 people are being killed today. And his thesis was just a good common sense psychological observation that as abnormal behavior becomes more and more common and ubiquitous, your threshold for defining what's abnormal is defined downward. So behavior that you previously would have thought outrageous, right? You once used to think that listening to a child use the F word in casual conversation would be enough to get some adult to go, have his mouth cleaned out with soap. Is now, it's just part of the ether. And something similar, of course, has happened politically in that Trump will say, we have a president who will say and do things that just 2 years ago would have completely shocked the system. And now the risk and the challenge is, how do you not become cavalier in the face of these continuous outrages to what used to be normative standards of political behavior? And that's a very tough challenge. John McCain said something I think astute, and this is to your point, Max. She said, I can't be the car alarm that's constantly going off, that in which case, you had to ask yourself, when do I for what do I hold my fire? And the insidiousness of his brand of populism is that it forces us to ask that question all the time. For what am I going to hold my fire so I can nail him on that, and that it will have some effect as opposed to just leading people to continue to shrug?
Somebody maybe should write a book called The Death of Outrage, except that Bill Bennett already wrote such a book, and he is an exemplar of the death of outrage because he is somebody who was decrying what Bill Clinton was doing to our country and is perfectly fine with what Donald Trump is doing. Let me ask a question of the panel, if I could. I mean, it's striking how you have these transnational movements. In the 1848, you had liberal nationalism breaking out all across Europe. In 1968, you had youthful progressive uprisings across the West. And right now you see these right-wing authoritarian or populist movements, as well as ultra-left movements perhaps in reaction to that. What accounts for the fact that so many of these institutions in liberal democracies are under siege, when arguably you could certainly make the case that these are the most successful political systems in history?
Well, one of the reviewers of this new book of ours said that he enjoyed most of the essays, but a couple of them were sort of arid and academic. And I thought, I wonder if he's talking about me. So the answer I would give is something I've been writing about for a while. I'm still writing about it. I think that the founding of the American state at the end of the 18th century set a model for imperial state nations, a model that Napoleon changed and that was picked up around the world. The refounding of this state in the 1870s and Lincoln's reliance on the Declaration, I might add, began an era of industrial nation states that was picked up by Bismarck and that eventually spread throughout the world. Over these 2.5 centuries, we've had two constitutional orders that were strategically dynamic and shaped the system of states. I think we're on the cusp of another such change, and I think that these various revanchist, these reactionary movements on the right and on the left, like Mr. Corbin, are a reaction to that. That the problems that the nation state successfully conquered set in motion new problems as to which this constitutional order is really not quite capable. I'll just give you one example. One of the innovations of the industrial nation state was the development of weapons of mass destruction. By the adroit use of those weapons, we ended a terrible war and we kept another war from the beginning. Now, those weapons are becoming commodified, and they will leak into the hands of smaller and smaller groups, non-state groups, state groups that have clandestine sponsorship of small groups, businesses, business groups that sell them. And that's not the sort of problem that we're configured to solve.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I agree that it's at a certain point, every political system, even the most perfect one, reaches the point where it could not cope with new problems that somehow emerged within the society. And I couldn't agree more with Philip that we are now at this point. And that's why it's very important for us to actually understand what kind of values we'll use to do these reforms. American political system just undergone these reforms a couple of times. We can just look back in the middle of the 19th century, where two major parties, Whigs and Democrats, were splitting. Democrats for South and North, and Whigs, by the way, for Know Nothing and Republicans. So it's the when you look at the North and South conflict, again, this is the. Yes, I don't want us to use these historical parallels, but it was also economically dominant North and politically all-powerful South. Today, when you look at the split of the red and blue waves in the country, it's based on the 2016 elections. 2/3 of national GDP is produced in the blue states, while the red states they have much more power, partially because of the system that allows small states to have equal representation in the Senate. So I think the Kavanaugh confirmation that's had 51 votes in the Senate had just over 50. But it has just slightly over 40% of population represented. Again, I'm not here just to question, there's the wisdom of the system that has been introduced by founding fathers, but we are in the 21st century, and certain things that were quite obvious for them and served well at the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century and 20th century, now could be revisited. I mean, just for instance, when you talk about the life tenure in the Supreme Court, when it was introduced, what was the lifespan in this country? 40 plus years. Maybe for upper classes, 50 years. Now it's 80 plus. So that it definitely changes our perspectives. So the Second Amendment was a part of the U.S. Constitution, a Bill of Rights, at a time where you could kill one person in 2 minutes. You had to reload your gun. Now you can kill 500 people in 2 minutes. Again, there are new challenges, and then we can look at economics and growing inequality and introduction of new machines, intelligent machines that could threaten many jobs. And the reason of the rise of the far right or far left is that they normally point out at the real problems that the governing parties, the center, pretends to ignore. Of course, they come up with wrong answers, but since they are the only, this is the only game in town. They are the groups that raise these issues, so they can resonate with the voters. And it's very important that we will retake this initiative. We will not let them to have monopoly on asking questions and giving people easy answers and offering them something that is, of course, it's a fake and fantasy and it's not going to work. But since there's no other authority in the room, they can steal the show.
Well, I think one thing that is absolutely vital, and I suspect we all probably agree on this, is the political duopoly in the United States is increasingly serving us ill. In a healthy political system, typically the fringes bend towards the center, right? The fringes seek the respectability of the center. And in the last several years, we increasingly have a system in which the center is bending toward the fringes, in which Bernie Sanders is improbably, I mean, at least by the standards of a few years ago, improbably influential among Democrats, and the kind of Buchananite Trumpist wing of the Republican Party among Republicans. So, you know, what Garry just mentioned about the collapse of the party system in the United States in the 1850s is something we could use here, because I think most of us in this room, I think most of us in our ordinary lives sense a deep disquiet internally with whatever party we just happen to vote for, because they're not quite as bad as the other person. How do you go about actually creating a politics in which a third party like that could arise? In fact, it's not a crazy idea, because we've witnessed exactly that phenomenon in France with Macron. Macron now has all kinds of political troubles. Let's see where he is in a couple of years. But he signifies a certain kind of health in the Fifth Republic, in the French system, that it was able to reach beyond these stale alternatives with which it had been presented, and look for a figure like him. I think a question for the United States is whether that can be done here. And if this book serves a long-term political purpose, it's to create a kind of an intellectual foundation for that kind of person. I don't know if the name is Bloomberg or Sass or Hickenlooper or any number of people, but for purple state America, if you will, and most of us are at least a little bit purple, right? To find a vehicle to express its political preferences, which are not being represented by are being no longer well represented by either party.
Questions from?
First of all, I'd like to thank all of you. I know individually you've all spoken here, but together it really has been a dream team. A morning to remember. But I'd like to open the floor to questions, and because we only have a short time, I'd like to remind you to introduce yourself and keep your question very brief and to the point. Well, we'll start over here. Oh. They'll bring you a mic.
My question is for Garry. I'm Suna Vidinle, and my question is, it seems, because I think Garry is able to read the global implications of what's going on as well, when this country coughs, the rest of the world gets the flu, and it's almost not just the flu, it's like an epidemic. So how are you reading, like just Jamal Khashoggi being murdered in Saudi embassy? Like, do you think that the likes of Putin or MBS in Saudi Arabia, how are they reading what's going on here? So it's fight for liberty, not just here, but for the rest of the world, it seems.
My Soviet experience, I remember that the wars of US presidents mattered a lot. So whatever Harry Truman said, JFK, Ronald Reagan, it resonated with millions and millions of people on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And today, unfortunately, the effect is exactly the opposite. You know, Donald Trump's statements, they encourage not those who are fighting for freedom, but those who are suppressing it. And the fact is that Donald Trump could question every institution, every alliance, and even moral values that America has been promoted over decades globally. Definitely, you know, helps authoritarian leaders around the world just to push their agenda, because it's like a poison of impunity. If President of the United States, you know, could afford being so critical about democracy and blasting his fellow leaders from the democratic countries while praising dictators and almost openly showing his envy that he could not do the same things to the opposition as they did and is still doing, it has tremendous effect, and it's a negative effect. And it's not just a cough, it's a virus. And that's why it's very important that we still have institutions here that are just opposing Trump, and every statement from Washington, D.C. that comes from the Senate or the House or other agencies in the U.S. Capitol, they help to soften the blow from Trump's brazen assumptions and accusations. But at the end of the day, it's still about the President of the United States, who could set up the right tone to help those who are just trying to turn the tide and to start, spreading democracy around the world.
James Starkman. One of the most remarkable migrations in history was Bret Stephens' migration from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times. And I just wonder, apart from the possibility that Godfather Sulzberger made an offer to you that you couldn't refuse, what really lay behind that?
I thought the remarkable migrations involved the land bridge between Asia and North America, the exploration of, well, anyway, but okay. I actually, so I didn't ask for a raise from the Times. I asked that they meet the same terms that I had at the Journal financially. So it was not a financial interest. There were a couple of considerations. One of them was I was not simply a columnist for the paper. I was deputy editor of the editorial page. And I did not feel in good conscience that I could represent the editorial page in that way. That is to say that my views as a columnist were so increasingly out of step with my responsibilities as an editor with a page that took a consistent line that I had to make a break. So that was one issue. The second one was, the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal isn't exactly pro-Trump, but it's anti-Trump. In the way that during the Cold War there were communists, there were anti-communists, and then there were anti-communists who just disliked the anti-communists more than they disliked the communists. And being anti-Trump meant being anti-Brett. In the context of the editorial page. I thought that was a particular cop-out. Look, if you like Donald Trump, right, because you think he's going to make America great again, God bless you. That's your thinking. But if you can see Trump for exactly who and what he is, and still say, that's okay, then I find that kind of nauseating, to be honest. There's something amiss with saying, I know that he's a pig. I know that he's disgusting. I know that if he were a Democrat, I would oppose him tooth and nail. I know that his views on Russia are foul, and so on. And still I'm going to support him. Why? Because he's not a Democrat. So one of the tests that I've applied consistently is if Barack Obama were carrying out exactly the policy that Trump is carrying out, what would conservatives be saying? And I think that's one test. The second issue is, I actually thought the Times would be a good fit for me. James Bennett, the relatively recent editorial page editor, formerly of The Atlantic, is really a superb editor who I think wanted to broaden the conversation and create more Sturm und Drang on the editorial page. He certainly has succeeded. Make it just a more interesting place for a broader set of views. And that was the vision that he sort of came to me with. And it was just a very, very appealing one. And the Times has been nothing but lovely towards me. The Sulzbergers, father and son, and at least the senior people on staff. Some of the younger people aren't quite in tune with my sensibilities, but I'm an acquired taste.
Time probably for one more question, so you have your hand up first, so we'll go over there.
John Richardson. I accept the stimulating debate and the back and forth, but it's the liberal elites versus the right-wing elites that are bothering us. And again, one side has the advantage, the other has the advantage. What does the panel think of the history that apparently has been studied by, there's a man called Walter Scheidel, who I think he's a professor at Stanford. He's Austrian originally, but he wrote a book which essentially says that since the end of the hunter-gatherer phase of life and the start of modern agriculture, elites, I guess whether they're right-wing or left-wing, have always managed to take all the surplus. And the only way in which there's ever been any real leveling and social progress is by war and pestilence. So, you know, what we're waiting for now is the next war. I mean, what do you think of that?
I think that's nonsense. I think that the progress of mankind has often been retarded by war and pestilence, and that elites, whether your taste or not, have moved us in science and mathematics. They've moved us to conquer the oceans, to develop wealth far beyond anything hunter-gatherers could do. I think the idea that what this country or any country needs is a good war is a terrible folly. And I write as someone who's studied the history of war for decades.
Just very briefly, my mother arrived in this country as a refugee with $7. So sometimes I'll find that Tucker Carlson has attacked me as an out-of-touch elite. I'm thinking, well, there's the son of Ambassador Richard Carlson, and I'm the out-of-touch elite. I mean, I just use, my own case, and I think this is true. I mean, certainly I know it's true of Max. How quickly within a single generation, or maybe two, at least in this country, people move from the very margins of society to the center. Now, it's true that there's always going to be ossification of elites, but so long as you have a system which is fundamentally meritocratic, right, you are going to, and open, you're going to be able to diversify your elites. Just a week ago, I had an opportunity to speak to the class of young journalists at Stuyvesant High School. And I would say 80% of that class were clearly the children of Asian immigrants. Now, 50 years ago, those would have been all probably mostly Jewish kids who were the children of, I don't know, Russian immigrants and so on. And I have no doubt that in 50 years' time, it will be some other striving immigrant group. But so long as that is where we are as the United States, I'm not afraid of the rise of the elites. Sears Roebuck just collapsed. Draw the lesson of that. Sears Roebuck was the Amazon of its day. Things rise in this country and they fall, and that's actually as it should be.
It's a good point about elites, but we're in the 21st century, and everyone has this device in his or her pocket or a purse, and that has changed everything, because elites could dominate the debates where there were very limited ways of participating. Now anyone can just collect data and even just to get into the debate. Now, our problem is that we still, live in a world that is being dominated by the governing philosophy of the 19th or 20th century. We just don't recognize that we are now dealing with what I would call iPad generation. It's always interactive. So, and we pretend it's still one-way street. And also, I think we lost our passion for explorations, and we let illiberal forces, the rulers of the unfree world, to use the technology that has been invented in the free world to undermine the very foundation of the free world. So it's very important for us to just recognize that this technological progress that has been conceived and realized here in the free world could and should be used to promote our agenda. And it's just about finding the right strategy. But we just have to live with the fact that it's not about elite, 100,000 here, 100,000 there. It's about potential billions of people that could get in. And I think it's eventually, if we find the right framework of engaging this massive crowd into the debate and making them politically active, we'll just, we'll turn this tide.
Philip, Garry, and Brett, I really have to thank you for a very stimulating conversation and hope this is the beginning of a debate that brings fruit. Thank you all for being with us.